Hey everybody, this is Dr. Hall. Welcome to lecture 15, where we're talking about the somatic motor system. So the somatic motor system is these efferent pathways, so signals coming from the central nervous system out to the body that are going to result in the voluntary and purposeful movement of our skeletal muscles. So this is how we move our body. So it's sometimes called the somatic motor system, sometimes the somatomotor system. They both mean the same thing. So I'm of course referring to body. So this is how we move our bodies. So this lecture is broken up into 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about what's happening in the cerebral cortex that's involved with movement. Then we're going to talk about some modulating areas that are also located in the brain. Then we're going to move down into the neural pathways and the tracks that are going to travel through the brainstem and the spinal cord. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the neuromuscular junction, which is how our nervous system actually communicates to the muscle cells themselves. Here we go. So let's start with the cerebral cortex. So of course, remember the cerebral cortex is that outer rind of gray matter in the cerebrum. So when it comes to choosing to move our bodies, first we have to decide what we're going to do. So the prefrontal cortex, which is shown here in blue, there's a lot of blue things. So the most anterior part of the frontal lobe here is the prefrontal cortex. Now that is involved in general in planning, decision making, and judgment. It's often referred to as kind of the executive functions, if you think of it as being kind of the CEO that's making all of the decisions for the brain. So my prefrontal cortex might have been pondering whether I should go make myself a cup of coffee, for example. And let's say I decide, yes, I do want to go make myself a cup of coffee. Well, then I'm going to involve my posterior parietal cortex, which you see here in purple, which you might remember is part of that dorsal stream of visual processing to figure out where things are in relationship to each other. So that's going to tell me, okay, well, the coffee machine is over there, and between here and there, there's some chairs, there's a table, there's a doorway, there's some things that I have to navigate, and then the cupboard for the mugs is up above, the coffee is in the other cupboard, right? So kind of planning out and mapping out all of the different things in my environment that I will be potentially interacting with as I go ahead and execute those series of movements. So we've got the prefrontal cortex, which is the decider, so to speak, deciding what it is that we're going to be doing. And then the posterior parietal cortex is helping us put it into context in terms of our environment and our surroundings. Then we have to figure out how we're actually going to make it work. So there are 2 areas in the brain that are called what are referred to together as the motor association cortex. We've seen this before, right? We had visual association areas in the occipital lobe to help us make sense of and interpret visual information. We had association areas in the parietal cortex to help us interpret and understand and make sense of somatosensory information. So this time, because the signals are coming from the brain and going out, I'm not making sense of something that's happened out there. I'm deciding how I'm going to make something happen from here when I send it out. So these 2 areas are involved in what's called creating a motor plan. What sequence of actions am I going to need to do? Just to stand up from this chair, I'm going to have to turn and pivot. I'm going to have to activate my hip extensors. I might actually activate my upper extremities and put my hands down on the table for balance. And then I'm going to have to walk, right? So there's a whole sequence of things that have to be planned out. And so this is something that right now, as an adult, I've done this gazillions of times in my life, gotten up from a seated position at a table and walked over to a counter and made myself a cup of coffee. But if you haven't done something before, you're going to do a lot of what's called anticipation and rehearsal. So you might kind of map out, okay, I'm going to have to stand up first. So these muscles are going to contract, and then I'm going to pivot, and then I'm going to walk over there. So this whole motor plan, which you may also rehearse. Now, if you've ever done dance or even perhaps certain plays in sports, you know the importance of rehearsing things even in your brain. And what's interesting is that when you imagine yourself doing these activities, some of these areas in the motor association cortex light up just as if you were about to do them. So that's why rehearsing a physical movement in your brain, just kind of going through the motions in your head, is actually very helpful. It helps reinforce that motor plan. Cool stuff. Now, this association cortex has, the supplemental motor area and the premotor area. Sorry, I kind of skipped over those. We're talking about them together because it's not super clear exactly what the divisions are, but I want to call out a special area called Broca's area. So Broca's area is often considered part of these motor association cortexes, but it's a very, very specialized region because it's involved with all of the motor planning that goes into being able to execute speech and language. So being able to talk, there are so many very precise and specific actions that we need to do with our throat and our lips and our diaphragm and our tongue in order to make the sounds of words. So Broca's area is involved in that. It's also involved in writing. So again, taking a sequence of motor actions that are important for communicating language and also sign language. So Broca's area we'll talk about more again when we talk about speech and language, which is coming up soon. Okay, so my prefrontal cortex has decided I'm going to make a cup of coffee. My posterior parietal cortex has kind of mapped out where in my environment I can go to do that. And my premotor area and my supplementary motor area, together known as the motor association cortexes, have kind of mapped out what the sequence of events is going to need to be, what sequence of muscles I'm going to need to contract in what order. So now I'm going to make it happen. And the part of the brain that makes it happen is called the primary motor cortex. So we've seen this before, the primary sensory area, the primary visual area. So this is the primary motor cortex, and it is located just anterior to the precentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is that groove in the cerebral cortex that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and that gyrus, that folding up of cerebral cortex that's just anterior to that, is where we will find the primary. It's the precentral gyrus. That's where we will find the primary motor cortex. I'm sorry, central sulcus is the groove. My bad. I was reading the diagram bad. All right, so central sulcus is the groove. Precentral gyrus is the gyrus that's right in front of the central sulcus. That is where we find the primary motor cortex. So what's going on here? So this is the actual actuators. This is what's making muscle contractions happen. So the neurons that are located here are called upper motor neurons. We'll meet the lower motor neurons later. And they're going to send axons down through the spinal cord or the brainstem that are going to signal the muscles to contract. So this is what's going to actually make it happen. Once we've decided what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, these guys make it happen. Now, the arrangement of those upper motor neurons in that precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex is arranged according to body area. So that's what we call somatotopic organization. We saw that for the somatosensory system, right? That sensory information from the hand all came to areas near each other, from the foot all came to areas near each other, and so on. So we find the same thing for the primary motor area. And so this is called the motor homunculus. Much like we had the sensory homunculus, this is the motor homunculus. And again, as you look, as they've kind of created this cartoon of the different body parts that are supplied by these areas, we get a lot of surface area, we get a lot of volume for the hand and the face and the tongue and the lips and the pharynx, because we have lots of precise and specific actions that we can do here. So we need lots of specific motor neurons for specific actions. Whereas if you look at the trunk, let me circle where the trunk is for you here. So that like your whole trunk, which is like a lot of real estate of your body, doesn't take up much of the homunculus. What can you do with your trunk? You can bend it this way, that way, that way, that way, and you can twist it, right? But that's about it. Nothing very subtle. So you don't need a whole lot of axons. You don't need that kind of precision signaling. So we don't have as much surface area. So this is a diagram that I thought was pretty nice from Encyclopedia Britannica that shows you that sensory homunculus and the motor homunculus. You can see they're very similar. They're not exactly similar. So although we receive a lot of sensory information from our hand, we actually send more motor information to our hand. Same thing with the face. And you'll notice that we have no motor homunculus for the teeth and gums, whereas we do on the sensory side, but I can't move my gums. So they're very, very similar, but there are some differences that I will not require you to know. I just thought it was interesting to look at. And again, you can see that primary motor cortex here, the somatomotor cortex in kind of the pinker color, is in that precentral gyrus right in front of the central sulcus, and in the frontal lobe, and the somatosensory cortex here is in that postcentral gyrus, that very first gyrus of the parietal lobe. So in summary, for the cerebral cortex, we have lots of areas involved. So our prefrontal area is decision-making, deciding what actions we're going to do. The posterior parietal cortex is giving us the context of where everything is located to then help our motor association areas to plan out the sequence of movements necessary to make that action happen. So they're going to create the motor plan, and they're also involved with anticipating and rehearsing those things to help it go more smoothly. And then, of course, we have Broca's area, which is a special motor association area for speech and language. Once that all gets worked out, the primary motor area is where the upper motor neurons are located, and they're going to be the ones to send the signal and actually make the actions happen. And they are arranged in a homunculus, just like we saw for the somatosensory system. All right, next we'll talk about some modulating influences in the brain. See you there.